I'm Tom Hoppy, and I'm your host of the Most Painful Podcast. Many Canadians are living with chronic pain, and chronic pain can impact a person's quality of life. Studies have shown that Canadian military veterans suffer from chronic pain twice that of the Canadian population. Why is that? The episodes of the Most Painful Podcast will dive deep into the research and the causes of this. Today's episode, we're going to talk to Dr. Ramesh Zacharias, who is the CEO of the Chronic Pain Center of Excellence for Veterans and the medical director for a pain clinic in Hamilton. Dr. Zacharias, welcome to the show.
My pleasure, Tom.
Ramesh, you and I have spoken in the past, and I know you have an extensive experience in pain medicine. But for our audience, I was wondering if you can just give them some background on your experience and also why the CPCOE was established and the goal of the CPCOE.
Yeah, so my background is I'm actually a surgeon by training. And for the first probably 20 years, I worked as an ER physician. And in 2004, I changed my practice to focus on chronic pain. And one of the reasons I decided to do that was I noticed in the emergency department the fact that chronic pain was not managed very well. And then in 1994, I started to work with the Department of National Defense. And from 2000 to 2005, the company I ran provided health professionals to the 37 bases across coast to coast for the Canadian Armed Forces. I realized that chronic pain was even a bigger problem for those who were serving than for the civilian population. And in 2018, I spoke at a conference for Veterans Affairs Canada and was then approached to see as to whether at McMaster University and the Michael DeGroote Pain Clinic, we would be interested in establishing a center of excellence for chronic pain for Canadian veterans. And so July 29th, 2019, Minister McCauley announced the awarding of the Chronic Pain Center of Excellence for Canadian veterans at McMaster University and Hamilton Health Sciences, and I'm the CEO, President, and Medical Director.
That's excellent. I mean, quite the background and experience. And I remember when I first met you in 2020, January, before COVID, and you had talked about chronic pain in veterans. And I'd like to ask you, I mean, what did you notice was some of the differences between veterans and the civilian population when it came to chronic pain?
So when I started to focus my practice in 2004, I was only looking after civilians. It was in 2012 that I started to look after veterans. And I came to realize that while there are similarities, there are some significant differences between veterans with chronic pain to civilians. I often tell veterans, and I look after probably 60% of my practice today is veterans. I often say to them that their DNA is what got them into trouble with that chronic pain. But frankly, their DNA is going to help them get out of their trouble with chronic pain because most civilians see chronic pain as a warning sign that maybe your body's telling you to slow down or stop doing things. When you're in the Canadian Armed Forces and you experience pain, it is almost felt that you will not identify it, that you will just push through it because your biggest concern is if you disclose it, there's a possibility that you will then start down the road of being medically discharged. But this is what you wanted to do all your life. So as a consequence, you don't disclose it to anybody. You just continue doing what you were doing. And sadly, you only make yourself worse over time.
And then we hear that from a lot from veterans, and that comes to the culture and identity, which is actually one of our episodes that we're going to talk about. And I've heard you talk about that many times when you see veterans in the clinic of sense of purpose and different identity. The CPCOE has only been up for 2 years now, but I understand there's like over 32 research projects that are underway, which is a lot for that time space. And I think we're going to talk about some of those on future episodes. I think this will be helpful for veterans, but do you also see that this could be scaled up and be helpful for the families and as well maybe some of the civilian population?
If I focus now on veterans, unfortunately, pain is never only the problem of the veteran. it has an impact on the family as well. It has an impact on the children as well. So when we set up the Chronic Pain Center of Excellence, it was to focus on the well-being of veterans and their families. And so we're very keen on making sure that we look at all of those in a holistic approach. So before we launched the center, I traveled coast to coast and had breakfast with veterans. And in some cases, they brought their spouses. And one of the first lessons I learned in my very first meeting was that if we were to make a difference, we better include the families and not just the veteran, because often the veteran will not disclose how much they're struggling, but it's the spouses, the family members who suffer the consequences. At the Michael DeGroot Pain Clinic, one of our members of our team is a social worker who focuses on the family while we focus on the veteran who is experiencing pain. So I'm absolutely proud of the fact that veterans play a key role in our organization. We have an advisory council of veterans that determines what topics we will research. And then with your leadership at the advisory council and our director of operations, Paul Roos, we have tremendous amount of input from veterans, and 4 of our 9 board members are veterans as well. I have always felt we're just the custodians of the research center that belongs to the veterans. So if we are going to be successful, we need to include them. And all of our topics that we have developed over the last 2 years were topics that veterans told our researchers. They came up with a long list, and we slowly worked through that, and we probably will work through it over the next 2 years. We also felt if we were going to sustain the growth, we need to bring new researchers into the fold. And so we have 5 very bright young people who are focusing in their master's and PhD program on veteran mental health and chronic pain. So we're excited, but we're only starting. There's much that needs to be done.
That does sound exciting, and the concept of having veterans engaged right from the start, I think, is important because it goes back to what you mentioned earlier on: is the DNA is different, and to have that perspective, I think, not just for the veteran but perhaps for the researchers and clinicians is helpful. I know we had talked about at the start of our when we first met, we talked about that you had mentioned the pain navigators and pain coaches. And I see that now, the importance of it, because it's about education and knowledge transfer. I guess the question I would have for you, Ramesh, is, from your experience in the clinic, if veterans are exposed to the research and knowledge, is that going to actually help them and their family move forward? The podcast, this is one of the reasons for the podcast, is to talk about subjects like identity and cannabis and psychedelics and actually using research to help knowledge. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think with veterans, one of the interesting things that I've found over the years is that veterans talk to veterans more than anybody else. And so they often will ask their colleagues or the people they served with what's actually working for them. So whether it's physical exercise, it's cannabis, or in some cases, psychedelics, the big source of their information is coming from other veterans. What we hope to do is to be able to inform all of the veterans and the case managers and health professionals to understand the unique nature and challenges of veterans. So one of our focuses is also how do we educate the family physicians who are looking after veterans. But more importantly, we want veterans to be fully aware of all the resources that they have access to so they can help each other.
That is an awesome approach. I think we know that in the veterans community, there sometimes is a lot of misinformation, and the research and the evidence-based, research would help alleviate some of that and also educate the veterans and the families.
If I want to come back to one of your points that you raised, which I think was really probably our first conversation going back to January of 2020, when you said the importance of veteran coaches. I think for those who have not served, you don't completely grasp the impact of service. You don't completely grasp identity. It's very difficult to grasp the fact that how could somebody who starting their career even in their basic training who gets injured will not tell anybody but will continue because they want to serve. The only people who understand that are veterans. And so mentorship has to be from people who actually understand the broad range of issues. I might understand the science of pain. I might also understand pain as a diabetic, but I don't understand completely what a veteran experiences, but usually other veterans will. So if we can coach the coach, train the mentor, I believe veterans ultimately will have greater access and better access to care.
Yeah, and I remember when we spoke about that, it kind of, rung a bell because I know leaving the service myself is understanding transition and identity is something that's not taught. It took me many years to learn, understand it, to be aware of it. And if one doesn't have purpose, like you've mentioned, or, where our DNA or the training that we get is mission first, self last, which is very different from any civilian organization. And I would argue even different than first responders because they have a limited right of refusal and have unions to support it. The military has none of that. Yeah, a person becomes numb to pain. And I think the other challenge too is, I've learned from yourself and many other professionals too, is the whole psychosocial side of it and how identity rolls into that when we're dealing with pain. So if a person goes through a pain clinic 3-4 months down the road, are they just sitting on the couch again with a lack of purpose, and does that affect their pain management? Like, I don't know the answer to that one.
I think one of the things that when I assess any patients, but especially veterans, I try to instill in them that there is hope. And in fact, when we were awarded the Center of Excellence, we got the domain name Keep Hope Alive. It was for that reason. We want the veterans who have frankly suffered in isolation and in some cases have completely gone off the grid. We want them to identify to them that there is hope. And the hope that exists is not ethereal, but real. The whole concept of interdisciplinary pain management, psychosocial model of pain, was developed by a physician called John Bonica, who was a U.S. military physician in World War II. When he was treating injured soldiers, he felt at a loss that he could not provide them what they actually needed. And it troubled him for years. And finally, he founded what's called the International Association for Study of Pain, which it promotes a biopsychosocial model. Because when people have pain, it's not just pain. It's not just physical pain. There's also the issues of sleep, PTSD, mood disorders. And so the approach they take is a biological, psychological, and social model. And the social model can be even just the family members. And so we have published data out of the Michael DeGroot Pain Clinic. One of our researchers, Dr. Lenny Happydoo, who tracks both civilians and veterans who come through our program. And both groups do well, but the veterans do better. And that comes back to their DNA. Once they understand the things they need to do to get better, you don't have to convince them twice. And then what we have to do is, over time, make sure they don't slip. And so having veterans participate in our research projects keeps them engaged with the center even longer, with the researchers. And so the research community, I think, has a slightly better understanding of veterans today than they did 2 years ago. There's still a lot of work that has to be done, but I think we are making baby step progress right now.
Yeah, and I think, what you talked about, interdisciplinary care, I And we're going to have a podcast with yourself and Dr. Brenda Lau talking about that when veterans go into a care clinic, like to have a better understanding. But that whole person approach, if I understand you correctly, that's, I guess, the intent of that is to look at both the bio and the psychosocial side and the education piece. Our DNA is different because of our training, because we've changed, not the civilian world has changed, we've changed. And even a simple thing like pacing, when someone said to me pacing, I thought they were going to run beside me. I didn't think then it meant for me to slow down because I had no concept of that. So yeah, I think the interdisciplinary approach and the education for that for veterans would be very important.
It's interesting you say that, Tom, because there are a number of things we teach in our program, and one of which is you've talked about pacing. I can tell you it's probably the hardest concept for a veteran to understand. Civilians will understand it. Veterans don't understand it. There's no such thing as pacing. I'm going to get this job done, and I keep working at it. And so pacing is key for them in trying to understand that you don't want to go through the cycle of good days and bad days. You want to have days that you can live in.
Which comes down to education, and which the CPCOE is doing with their research. And what we're trying to do with this podcast is the knowledge mobilization. We are going to wrap up here, and I thank you for your time, Ramesh. Your leadership in this and your vision has, I think, moved the markers a lot to help veterans. And I know the veterans that are aware of this are grateful for it. And our other programs that are going to come up are going to talk about a lot of this research. And we're going to have experts and guests. We're going to talk about identity, intergenerational pain with Melanie Knoll. We're going to talk about cannabis, the research on that, interdisciplinary care. So all those topics, I think, that are coming from the CPCOE, from the work you guys have been doing, I really do believe is going to help veterans and clinicians and their families and researchers. So I think it's an exciting time.
Yeah. So Tom, one last comment I'd like to make. And the veterans that I see, I start by thanking them for their service. And I quickly tell them, it's now my turn to serve you. And sometimes veterans have problems understanding that concept. They understand the concept of service. They don't understand the concept of receiving that service. And so the podcast, and I want to thank you for your service and your leadership. And I believe very strongly that educating veterans on what is available, what they need to do, will truly give them hope.
I agree with you. Well, thank you so much for your time, Ramesh. And like I said, your leadership. And we're going to dive deep into this for our next podcast. So I'd like to thank everybody for listening to the Most Painful Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Hoppy. Next one's coming up will be on identity and culture, which really plays a big part into how veterans approach pain. And like we said, this is not just for veterans, it's for their families, researchers, and clinicians. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you, Tom.
The Most Painful Podcast is produced for the Chronic Pain Center of Excellence by Story Studio Network and Eye Contact Productions.